All right, hi everybody. Thank you for coming today. As Teddy said, I'm a master's student at UW, and today I'm going to be presenting just a little bit of the data that I collected last summer on spatial and temporal trends on dissolved organic carbon, or DOC, as I'm going to be referring to it, in small fish-bearing watersheds here on the Olympic Peninsula. Okay. So many of you who are from around here are familiar with these small watersheds that have fish in them. And as has been mentioned in previous presentations, what we see on the land can really affect what happens in the streams. So that flux of nutrients that comes from the land into the streams is really important for aquatic ecology. And I'm particularly interested in the carbon that's coming off the land into the streams and what kinds of effects it has on the ecology of the streams, not just at the point where it's coming in, but further downstream as well. So DOC can come in many forms, many shapes and sizes. It can come out as really big molecules that vary in size and in reactivity with other things in the stream. So why is DOC important? I realize that this is something that not many people have thought about, but it's actually a very important solute in water. One, the size of the DOC can really affect the solubility of other compounds. So these organic molecules can affect the solubility of mercury in the water. In addition, these big carbon molecules are at the bottom of the food chain for a lot of the bacteria down or in the aquatic systems. So it's a very important food source. When you have the breakdown of carbon, you create humic and fulvic acids, and in addition to that, you have carbonic acids, which is not part of DOC. But those all affect the pH of freshwater systems. And lastly, when we're thinking about the carbon cycle and when we're trying to make estimates of the carbon that we have, our carbon sequestration estimates, carbon that is lost through aquatic systems is actually a terrestrial carbon loss. So there was a study recently done that estimated carbon loss through freshwater systems, and it estimated that about 54% of net ecological productivity in the Pacific Northwest is lost to streams, and it's either respired, it's processed in the streams and respired, so we have a loss in productivity, or it's carried all the way to the ocean and deposited off the coast as a carbon sink. So it's really important for us to tease out what is happening to this carbon and incorporate it into any carbon models that we may have. Why I'm interested in DOC on the Olympic Peninsula is because there's a lot of, the peninsula has a rich history of management, different management practices, and there's not a lot of data out there on how this affects the carbon cycle, particularly in aquatic systems. And on the Olympic Peninsula, a lot of the activities that go on here have affected carbon pools on the land and probably have had an effect in the aquatic systems as well. So the different harvesting practices that we have affect carbon pools on the land. The transfer of carbon from the land to the stream has been affected by the culverts that we've put in, the roads that we've built. And in addition to that, we also affect the processing that goes on in the streams. So this leads to kind of my very big question of how do watershed landscape characteristics affect spatial and temporal variability in stream dissolved organic carbon. And the reason why I'm interested in the Olympic Peninsula is, again, not only because there isn't very much data on how management affects DOC, a lot of studies have been done in more pristine environments, but it's also, a lot of people consider it like a carbon hotspot, a place where we sequester a lot of carbon through our forests. And I want to find out if this is true and how much carbon we're actually losing in the system, in the aquatic systems. So I collected data within 4 watersheds that are part of the Large-Scale Integrated Management Experiment, or the T3 study. Some of you may be familiar with this study. This is something that's happening on this is the Clearwater River right here. This is the Ho right up here. And this is a new study that's coming in that's going to test how the forest land plan is affecting community and environmental well-being. So we've heard about that a little bit in the previous presentations. And I collected data in, the treatments are split up into 4 blocks of 4 watersheds, each of which receive a different kind of treatment. I collected data in the watersheds that are getting the accelerated treatment. So accelerated means there's going to be some new innovative harvesting practices and post-restoration techniques. And I chose those watersheds because I wanted to really explore, really try to, in the future when these treatments are implemented, really link these treatments to changes in dissolved organic carbon. Now, each of these watersheds is split up into sub-watersheds, so I'm going to be saying watershed a lot. But the reason why they're split up this way is because the treatments for this study are going to go in at this spatial scale. So we'll have a treatment go in only at the sub-watershed level. I collected data 3 times in the summer and 3 times in the fall in each of the 4 watersheds. And I collected data in a spatial stream network here. So I collected data along the main stem, and then at every single point where we had a tributary, the water of the subwatershed coming in, I would collect data coming into that's coming from the subwatershed, right before the subwatershed and afterwards, just to see how the mixing effects going on there. Because for some of the points you had to walk up the stream, there are some points that I was only able to sample during the summer because it was too dangerous to walk up the stream in the fall when you have high flows. So just keep that in mind. So the 2 reasons why I chose this sampling design is 1, to collect pre-treatment data for the T3 experiment before we implement those treatments. And 2, I wanted to look at the spatial scales at which DOC varies on a stream network. And if we in the future, if we decide to only monitor DOC at the outlet, what kind of information are we missing by not sampling these points? So I'm going to dive right into the results here. Here I have 2 graphs that show my data in the summer and in the fall. This is showing DOC yield. Yield is calculated by multiplying the DOC concentration times the discharge that I measured at the outlet. On the x-axis here you have the dates. So in the summer I sampled from middle of July to middle of October, or I'm sorry, August, and then in the fall I got mostly October dates. And on the other y-axis you have discharge. This is discharge from a gauge on the Ho River. It's not, these are in the Clearwater, so it's not exact, but there is a little bit of sync going on between the two rivers. And up on the top here, it's light gray, we have precipitation that's measured in forks. So one thing that stands out really quickly is that we see, if we look at the scale for DOC yield in the summer versus the fall, we can see that there's a 50-fold increase. We have a lot, during the fall is when you have a lot of the carbon coming out of these watersheds being pushed downstream. And we can see also that in general, when we have these precipitation events, we can see that there are spikes in carbon yield. So there's a relationship between precipitation, discharge, and carbon yield. However, it's not exactly the same throughout. There is an effect of what's on the land, and that can be seen right here. I realize this is a little bit small for those of you guys in the back, but here we have, after a specific rain event, we have watershed A right here. We can see that it's the yield goes up, but in watershed D, the yield increases much more. So that makes me think that there's something on the landscape that is creating this larger jump in DOC yield. All right, this is a very busy slide, so I'll leave it up for a while so everybody can get accustomed to it. I have here kind of the spatial data of DOC on along the stream network. So on the x-axis here, you have distance upstream. So up here we have the headwaters, and as you move to the left, you're getting to the outlet. On the y-axis, we have dissolved organic carbon concentration, and these boxes each represent 3 of the watersheds. Watershed C was extremely steep, crazy to get through, so I only was able to get data at the outlet for that one. In here we also have the sub-watersheds are designated by this triangle, and points along the main stem are just regular circles. And lastly, the darker colors refer to a higher discharge. The lighter color refers to a lower discharge. So there are 2 main things to notice here. If we look at the spatial trend of carbon, we can see that as you move from the headwaters to the outlet, we have a decrease in concentration. So as you move downstream, you're losing, or you're diluting the dissolved organic carbon. But we see the opposite pattern here in watershed D. And I think the reason for that is hidden in the sub-watersheds, so these triangles. If you look at these guys, they are pumping out more carbon than what we see in the main stem. But we see the opposite in watersheds A and B. So the triangles are all below the main stem points. And that I think is probably related to what we are seeing on the landscape, some landscape characteristics. Lastly, I want to point out that the relationship with discharge is pretty unclear from this data. We would expect that at higher discharge, you have more water percolating through the soil, picking up more carbon, so you should see a higher concentration. But it's not very clear here in watershed A. We see here where we have the highest discharge, we actually have the lowest concentration of carbon. So it's a little bit unclear what's going on there. One reason we might think, one landscape characteristic that we might want to think about is the carbon pools that are on the landscape. And one very obvious carbon pool is deciduous matter or leaves coming from deciduous trees. And there definitely is variability between the watersheds on deciduous trees. So in watershed B, we see a lot less, mostly alder, than we see in watershed D. So we'd expect watershed D to have possibly more carbon coming through. But when we look at the data, it's not as clear, unfortunately. So here on the x-axis, we have the percent of the draining watershed that is deciduous, and on the y-axis, we have DOC. So these watersheds that are draining areas that have a lot of deciduous trees aren't putting out a lot of carbon. But then some of these areas here that have way less deciduous trees are putting out a lot of carbon. And I colored the points by mean slope to show that these points right here that are bright red, that have really low slope, those are the ones that are putting out more carbon. The reason for that is that when you have a gentler slope, the water has more time to percolate through the soil to slow the movement of water down. You have more wetland that gets created in these flatter areas, which results in more carbon accumulation and then more DOC. And then in the steeper slopes here, we can see that there isn't very much carbon coming out of there. However, when we further look at mean slope and how it might relate to precipitation, we can see that it's not the relationship is still a little bit more complex. So unfortunately, I didn't get a lot of variability in precipitation when I collected my data, but we can see that these points here that were sampled when we had high precipitation in the past 3 days, we would expect to see much higher dissolved organic carbon because you have higher precipitation, you have more water moving through the soil again. You expect for it to be putting it into the stream, but that's not necessarily the case. So what this is telling me is that we need a multivariate approach to understand how carbon is moving through the landscape. We need to incorporate things like climate, hydrological connectivity, groundwater influence, and even management history to really get at how how DOC varies on the landscape. And as if some of you guys went and talked to Jeff Keck in the back, we can see that, or we know that these streams are very flashy. When we have a rain event, the water moves through really quickly. So it's very difficult to kind of pinpoint the point when you have the highest amount of carbon coming through. So in conclusion, there are landscape characteristics and hydrological connectivity that these have nonlinear relationships with the DOC concentrations. And in the future, that's what I'm trying to iron out. I want to, using some statistical analysis, really identify the characteristics that play the biggest role in DOC concentration. And in the future, when the T3 experiment goes further down the road for that, hopefully we can assess the effects of management on DOC and how it affects stream ecology as well. And for even further down the road, hopefully contribute to the DNR carbon budget. And I didn't really include this because I didn't have enough time, but I'm also looking at carbon composition as well. So that's a whole nother ball of wax. So I want to say thank you to all the people that have helped me out with this. My advisors and a lot of the undergrads that braved the steep watersheds and got data for me. So thank you.